Right.
Okay. All right.
Thank you.
Got it. All right, so I'm going to share my screen, which is the PowerPoint presentation. This is very laid back, so if anybody has any questions, where am I on here? Share. You know, feel free to chime in. I don't know if I'll notice the raising of your hands. I know that that's a
I had asked everyone to post their questions in the chat, and if they don't
Okay.
feel comfortable, they can actually private message me, and then I'll answer. We'll ask them towards the end of the
okay.
workshop.
All right.
Thanks, guys.
So, but yeah, I'm fine if you interrupt me too, as I'm used to doing this. We do trainings. Heidi and I do trainings pretty frequently, actually. They used to be in person, and we bring lots of goodies, and we bring different, things to hand out, and different packets of information. But because of COVID, everything's kind of gone the Zoom way, and I think at some point we'll be getting back to doing these live presentations. So, like I said, we're laid back, and if anybody has a question and just wants to interrupt me, please feel free to do so. So. We are talking about the transition from early intervention to a school age program. And, parents of kiddos with disabilities, well, parents of children in general, going to kindergarten for the first time could be overwhelming. But especially when you have a child who has been receiving services through the early intervention program. So in general, the first part of the presentation, I'm just going to give you some general information about special education, because once a child transitions from early intervention to school age, it's all the same. A lot of the information that I'm going to give you in the law apply. So we're operating under two basics, there's other laws that are out there, but the federal statutes that we typically operate under are the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, otherwise known as IDEA, or Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. So these are both federal statutes. They apply across the country. So if you move out of the state, now your state regulations might change a little bit, but the federal statute doesn't change. So it's applicable wherever you go. The IDEA, and if you haven't figured this out by now, special education is an area of law that's just filled with acronyms. So I do have this great little cheat sheet that I've prepared that has a lot of the acronyms on it. If anybody wants that, you can certainly message me, and I can share that information with you. So IDEA is more specific to education, whereas Section 504 is a broader statute. So we try to operate under IDEA more so than 504. The IDEA actually requires the student to have a disability and be in need of special education. Specially designed instruction. So there must be something special about the instruction that's being delivered. Whereas Section 504 simply requires the student to have some sort of a disability and require some accommodations. So it's definitely not as robust. But when we're talking about the IDEA, when you first start out, if you're in birth to 3 services, those services are governed under a different part of the IDEA statute. They're Part C. But early intervention, as well as school age, they're governed under Part B, both of them. So what I'm talking to you about today, a lot of the different things I'm going to be talking to you about today are not only applicable to early intervention, your early intervention program, your 3 to 5, but also when your child transitions into the school age program. So these are the 2 federal statutes. They apply to your public schools, your charter schools, your intermediate units, but they're generally inapplicable to private schools. So if you have a child in a Catholic school, we were just talking about some of our kids being in Catholic school, these laws don't typically apply in the same way to those schools because they're not receiving the federal funding. And I have to be honest with you, I don't do a lot of work with Philadelphia. So if I understand correctly, Elwyn is in charge of the 3 to 5 program, right?
Right, they are the MELA.
Yeah. So in the rest of the state, the services are usually contracted through the local intermediate units. So that's why I have IU in here, but for Philadelphia, it would be Elwyn. So what is the essential goal of special education? Well, according to the IDEA, it's to ensure that students with disabilities attending public schools receive what we call a free appropriate public education. And this is one of the biggest acronyms you'll ever see. It's FAPE. and that's what you as a parent want your child to receive, or you as an advocate, if you're working with families, you want to ensure that that child is receiving a free, appropriate public education. And this word, this FAPE term, it's very, it's, what does that actually mean? There's a lot of litigation about it in the federal courts, and it is a term of art, and it does have meaning behind it, and it's been developed. The meaning is, it has different meaning in different circuits. We're in Pennsylvania, we're in the Third Circuit. But in Pennsylvania and in the Third Circuit, it means that children with disabilities from birth to age 21, so the year 21, the year in which the student turns 21, they're entitled to a program that's reasonably calculated to afford meaningful educational progress in all domains. When I say all domains, we're talking not just academics, but we're talking social, emotional, behavioral, physical. So you can have a student or a child who is doing very well academically, but still may require supports and services in school in order to make progress. So when we're looking at cases and we're looking at IEPs and evaluation reports, I'm not just looking at grades. I'm not looking at PSSA scores. I'm looking at everything. I'm looking at discipline records. I'm looking at, does the child have friends? I'm asking my clients, is your child invited to birthday parties on the weekends? Is your child involved in any activities after school? So they're, what's the discipline record look like? Are there suspensions? Are there detentions? Many times we get calls with cases who are, discipline cases. They're tough, and we'll ask parents, well, how's your child doing in school? Oh, they're doing great, straight A's, and I said, well, they're obviously getting in trouble. Oh yeah, well, they were suspended maybe 5 times this year, but the good student getting straight A's. I'm like, if your child's getting suspended on a regular basis, we need to take a look at that. So, or, we look at nursing records. Is the child going to the nurse? Is like I said, are there any physical impairments? Or, we're looking at fine motor skills, we're looking at gross motor skills. So we're looking at a lot. And when we talk about a meaningful educational progress in all domains, the way it's been described to me when I was going through my initial training is, when we're looking at a program, what the courts require is not necessarily like your Lamborghini and your Mercedes. You don't necessarily need a Cadillac kind of program. The school districts aren't required to provide that, but they also can't provide the child the car that's doesn't have an engine in it, or is maybe up in blocks in the in the yard with that doesn't run and that's being worked on. It has to be somewhere in between. It has to be a functional program that provides supports and services for that child to make progress. So that's what we're looking at. And again, it's a term of art, and it sometimes requires knowledge of some of the case law that's out there. But when I look at an IEP, I just I just know, like, this child is nonverbal and they're getting speech once a month. That doesn't just doesn't sound right to me. So that is what FAPE means. And as you go through this whole process, that's what you're always going to be looking at is the IEP offering FAPE, whether you're an early intervention or a school age program. So under the IDEA, for a child to be eligible, you have different categories. You have birth. Well, of course, services are birth to age 21, but it's broken down by ages 0 to 3. So the IDEA designates the Office of Child Development and Early Learning. So most counties contract with an agency to administer those birth to 3 services. Once that child starts to turn 3, then they transition to the local intermediate unit. The IDEA designates the Department of Public Education. But most counties will have a contract with the IU. And then when a child turns age 5, the responsible agency is turned over to local school district. And that's where we're focusing on, is when that child transitions from this 3 to 5 program to the school age program. There are various disability categories under the IDEA, and I have them listed on the next 2 slides. But for a child to be found eligible for services, they have to fit one of these disability categories. So I have all of those listed here. One I like to always point out is the other health impairment. That's kind of a catch-all. So if you have a child that has something that doesn't quite fit one of the other disability categories, such as ADHD, we're talking about that, executive functioning deficits. You're getting a lot of kids with autoimmune disorders, which affects their ability to attend school. They will fall under that category. So it's like a catch-all category if it's not specific. But I have those listed there. And I did want to point out that the last one I've listed here, developmental delay, that is only applicable for the 3 to 5 ages. Once a child transitions to the school age program, that is not an option. The child has to fit one of the other disability categories. So I just listed those there for your information. So again, this is just going back to, the first part of this is a broad overview, but when, in order to start services, it starts with an initial evaluation. And it's required when there's a reason to suspect the child has a disability and requires special education. And either the parent or the IU can initiate that evaluation process. A lot of times for kids who are in the 3 to 5 services, they are already transitioning from the 0 to 3 services. So you don't kind of have this child find necessarily, child find trigger is what we call it. But for those who are going right into, I've had kids without any services from birth to 5 go into kindergarten and everything falls apart. So at that point, the parent can request that evaluation. Or you have kids who haven't had the birth to 3 services, parent puts their child in preschool and there's behaviors, the parent can then initiate the evaluation through down in your area, the LWIN. So the parent can initiate it, or the preschool can recommend to the parent that they should have an evaluation, or if the child's already in the district, they can initiate that evaluation. This is I'm just going to kind of briefly go over the early intervention process. Looks like there's 2 chats. Am I supposed to open those? Oh, okay. Sorry. This early intervention process is the same for school age too. So I just wanted to, again, point that out because it's all falls under Part B. So when the IU or the school district issues a prior written notice, I always advise the parents review the prior written notice to see, it will actually list what assessments are going to be conducted. They're proposing to conduct. I've often had parents say, well, why didn't they do an OT evaluation? I thought, they would address fine motor. I'm like, well, we got to scale it back. We got to go back to the prior written notice. Was it listed there? And if it's not, then go back and ask. Or if there's something listed there, you're not sure what that means, ask those questions. So it's really important when you receive that prior written notice for the evaluation to look at that section to see what assessments the IU is proposing. If you think that there's more assessments that need to be done, then you can ask that those assessments be added. So according to, this is both IDEA and Pennsylvania regulations, the evaluation is required to be completed within 60 days from the date that the IU receives the consent, and that excludes the summertime. So IDEA says 60 days and didn't specify is that business days, is this calendar days, how do you calculate days? So Pennsylvania chimed in with their regulations. This was pre-2005, I think, and had it as 60 calendar days. And that was before 2005. IDEA was reauthorized in 2005. Pennsylvania took a couple of more years. I can't remember what year they finally changed their regulations, but the calendar days were kind of a nightmare for kiddos who were going to school. Or school days. It was school days, not calendar days. So if you think about all the days that the kids are off school, especially if you ask for an evaluation like in November. I mean, all the days the kids are off school. So it would count weekends and any days the kids didn't have school for holidays. So, it was taking an extremely long time for kids to be evaluated and offered services. So Pennsylvania did agree to change the legislature agreed to change that to 60 days. 60 days is 60 days, including weekends, but they gave in to the school districts on not having the summer days count. So, and that becomes a little bit more important when the child's actually in school, because, and I'm not familiar with how the program works down there, but I know in a lot of the other counties, they don't follow the same school calendar. They have like 2 weeks on, 1 week off, and it's very, it's just, which is actually hard for kids. The cases that we see from early intervention, it's the kids who typically need that consistency, and those breaks are really harmful for those kiddos. So I'm not sure how it is down there. So if anybody wants to, share that information, I'm interested in how their their calendar works, if they follow the school calendar with ESY, or if it's broken up like they do in other counties.
You mean Elwyn, Jennifer?
Yeah,
Yeah, they follow a stretch calendar as well.
yeah, I thought so. And I've seen that in most parts of the state. And, parents come, to me, and that it's frustrating. And then that we kind of ask, we try to get continuity through those breaks. And most of the time they just send packets home, and then they work, for parents to work on packets. But, so do you think,
For the
I'm sorry?
IU, for the intermediate unit, they do that?
Yeah,
Mm.
they can, for kids who would qualify for, like, if there's regression, and they would technically qualify for ESY, but there's no such since they do that stretch calendar and it's ESY, they will send these packets home for the families to do with their kids at home to so they don't have such a break. How I've seen that done here in Berks County. So in any event, if you think about all those days, going back to the school days, if going back to that model, it could often take quite some time to get that evaluation report. Reevaluations are mandated every 3 years by the IDEA. So it's feasible you only have one evaluation when you're in early intervention. You could have potentially have two when you transition from the birth to 3, and then another one when you're transitioning from early intervention into school age. And sometimes you'll have an evaluation by Elwyn and the school district as well. So, but those reevaluations are mandated every 3 years. And well, we can get into that. I like when the school district evaluates the child. I don't like when the school district actually relies on the early intervention evaluation. But the school district's not actually required to do that evaluation unless the eval is due at that 3rd year. If the triennial evaluation is due and the child's in the school at the time, then that has to be done by the school district. So when we have these evaluation reports or reevaluation reports, the IDEA requires that they are sufficiently comprehensive to identify the child's special education and related services needs. So by related services needs, we're talking about the additional behaviors or fine motor skills or speech and language or physical therapy and things like that. And that goes back to the prior written notice, why it's very important to make sure that the district is doing all the assessments at one time. Because what happens is if you know that you have a prior written notice that is only proposing to do, developmental assessments and parent input and observations, and or you suspect your child has a speech and language impairment and it's not listed, the evaluation report is not going to include that evaluation. And then if through assessments they determine, oh, this child does need a speech and language evaluation, they're going to issue another prior written notice, and they have another 60 days to do the speech and language evaluation. So if you know that your child has, fine motor skills deficits, gross motor skill deficits, executive functioning, like I said, communication issues, you want to make, behavioral issues, you'll want to ask for everything to be done all at one time, so you're not getting the program piecemeal. So comprehensive evaluation may include, cognitive testing, achievement testing. It's a little harder on the younger kids. They, when speaking and doing this as long as I've been doing it, I have and know a lot of psychologists, and typically from what I've heard from psychologists is that it takes till about age 8 to solidify an IQ. And once, that IQ is solidified at about age 8, then you typically don't see any drastic changes in your cognitive functioning unless something drastic has happened, such as, a traumatic brain injury, or if the child has not been exposed to any education whatsoever, you'll see that change in IQ. So, sometimes we'll see some of the WIPSI or a lot of times I'll see the Patel. So they're kind of doing some assessments, but I don't necessarily put a whole lot of stock in the cognitive and achievement at that level. I like to see some other type of readiness assessments at the at this age 3 to 5, because at this point they really haven't been exposed to an education, so we really don't know what their abilities are. And I have seen cases where their abilities are very low, but the parents are saying he's capable of he or she is capable of doing a lot more, and we don't necessarily want to put a ceiling on what a child's capable of doing. So But we do see some cognitive assessments, some kindergarten type readiness assessments, observations. We always want parent input. That's always necessary, and teacher input. And any type of like rating scales, social, emotional, behavioral assessments. Usually that's like a VASC or a brief that they'll provide to parents to complete, as well as teachers. And then any other, like I said, any other evaluations for related services. And that's not always included in the first round of testing, especially if the child isn't known to the system. So if you're transitioning from birth to 3 services, you'll have that input from those service providers, and you'll have a better chance of getting all the assessments that you need in that first round. But if you're new to the 3 to 5 system, you want to make sure that all the testing is done up front.
Hey, Jennifer, we had a question.
Mhm.
One parent asked, what are the repercussions if they do not complete the evaluation within the 60-day timeline?
Well, there's nothing set forth necessarily in the IDEA that if the ER is not issued in this set time frame, this is what happens. But there are remedies available under the IDEA. And one of them is if the district delays, what I always do is I ask for an independent. If the districts or the IUs are hanging on and not completing the evaluations, I ask for the school to fund an independent educational evaluation. When the parent asks for the school to fund it, that they have 2 options. They can say, I will fund it, or I will file for due process to defend it. There's no other magic option C. Oftentimes we'll say, well, just let us do it again, or let us get it done, and then let's wait. But that's not an option under the IDEA. So if they haven't completed it, they're not going to file for due process to defend an evaluation that hasn't been completed. So legally, I would recommend, what I tell my clients is request them to fund an independent because it's late. And what you want to make sure is that when they agree to it, and they typically do agree to it because it's cheaper to just pay for the evaluation than it is go to a due process hearing over it. You just want to make sure that if they have conducted any testing already, that the evaluator that you choose is not completing the same thing, because you don't want to compromise test results. The other option is too, if they're delaying the completion of the evaluation, and the evaluation, say the parent doesn't ask for the independent and they sit tight, they wait for that evaluation report, it's 30 days late. And it says that the child's eligible for services. Well, the IU has another, and the school district has another 30 days to develop an IEP, develop a program. Well, that child's now missing out on 30 days of supports and services. So then a parent, under the procedural safeguards, they can pursue compensatory education, either through mediation or through due process, and ask for the school to make up those hours that were missed during that time frame when that evaluation was late. So that is a remedy under, both of those remedies are remedies under the IDEA in general. It doesn't specifically say if the ER is late, then this is the repercussions, but that is legally what we pursue. So once the ER is completed, and if it concludes the student is eligible for special education services, then the team the school has 30 days to offer that IEP. So there is, like I said, that waiting timeline there. So again, it goes back to the evaluation. You want to make sure that the evaluation is comprehensive. It's identifying all the needs so that when the team gets together to develop the program, it's going to be a robust program and address all the needs of the child. If the evaluation report comes back and it says that the student is not eligible, then the school has to issue a notice of recommended educational placement. This is another one of our infamous acronyms. So we call it a NOREP. And the parents can either accept it or they can reject the NOREP. There's different boxes on the NOREP, and they can file for due process. But in order to trigger, you can't, some parents don't understand this, but just by checking the box on a NOREP, nothing's going to happen if you just check it and do nothing else. You have to actually check the box and physically file a complaint form. And parents can file their own complaint form with the Office of Dispute Resolution. And I have at the end of this presentation, I have the link for ODR's website, which has a lot of information on mediation and due process and parents and filing forms. So if a parent disagrees that the student is eligible, they can file for due process. The other thing they can do, again, if the evaluation report comes back and it's not comprehensive, the parents could also ask for an independent educational evaluation, again, at that point when the ER is completed, and get their own expert, on board. And then if that expert opinion comes back and says the student is eligible, let the school either accept those expert findings or not, and then it becomes a battle of the experts at a due process hearing. But having an independent is one way to get an expert for the parents for free, basically paid for by the school, if you end up having to go to a due process hearing. So provided the child is found eligible for services, the next step is the development of the IEP. Again, another famous acronym. So an IEP is an actual written statement for each child with a disability. It's developed, it's reviewed, it's revised in a meeting with parents and relevant professionals. So it's pretty robust. I mean, there are 20 plus pages, many of them. I've seen some that are 50, I've seen some that are 75. I don't like to see them that large because then I have to question what teacher's actually implementing this IEP, but it is an actual written statement. And I point out it is pretty robust. It's pretty long because compared to a 504 plan, they're usually 2 pages. So you really want to, if your child's having issues, you really want to push to have an IEP versus a 504 plan. So the IEP must be developed for a child within 30 days of the school finding the child eligible. And then that IEP, if everybody agrees, it goes into place. It's in place for a year. It has to be, minimally, it has to be reviewed annually. But if there are concerns, a parent can certainly ask for meetings throughout the year. You're not limited. In other words, you're not limited to 1 meeting per year.
Quick question.
Yeah.
On the previous slide, who conducts the evaluation report? Really, who conducts the evaluation? Would it be Elwyn or the school district?
Yeah, here for early intervention, it would be Elwyn would be doing the evaluation for 3 to 5. And we'll get into when the school district's obligations kick in. So for the 3 to 5 services, you're having Elwyn do that evaluation. And if you're not happy with that evaluation, you're asking Elwyn to fund the independent evaluation. If you're in the school age program, then you're asking the district. So, and then, once if Elwyn finds a student eligible, it's the Elwyn team finding or developing that IEP. I often get questions who's required to be a member of the IEP team when you're developing that IEP. So there are 5 main players on the IEP team. Parent is of utmost importance. The school cannot unilaterally develop a program without the parents' input. So they have to make efforts. And, we do have parents out there that are not necessarily cooperative at all times, but the school, Elwyn, and the school districts, who's ever the LEA, the local education agency, is required to make efforts to have a parent present at the IEP meeting. The next higher in the hierarchy is a local educational agency. In this case, it would be a representative from Elwyn, who is the person that has authority to commit funds to the program. If you're at a meeting and you ask for, say they're offering 30 minutes of speech and language once per 7 days. If you ask for 45 minutes and they say, I'll have to go talk to my supervisor about that, you don't have an LEA at your meeting. Because that person who is there acting as the LEA, if they don't have that authority, it's truly not an IEP meeting. So you really want to make sure that the person who's there offering the program and talking about the program has the ability to make changes and offer, like I said, commit funds to that program. You also want a regular education teacher of the child, if that's the case. Some kids in the early intervention program don't have that. You'll certainly want your special education teacher of the child. And then also somebody who is able to interpret any testing results. Oftentimes the LEA can be that same person, but if you do have an evaluation report that was just completed, you either want that school psychologist to be at your IEP meeting, or you would have wanted to have that. A lot of times the school psychologist, there'll be that first initial meeting to review the results of that evaluation report. Some schools will do that first. So you'll want to have a meeting at some point with the school psychologist so you have a true understanding of the results of the evaluation report. A lot of times the school psychologist will have that pre-meeting with the parents rather than sit through an entire IEP meeting. So this is applicable, like I said, in the 3 to 5 program as well as the school age program. Other relevant members can be there too. The child has speech and language, the speech and language therapist can be there, the OT, if there's related service providers. If a parent wants to have somebody present, the parent can certainly have somebody present. I do caution parents, if you're ever taking an attorney, don't just show up with an attorney. That has to be coordinated with Elwyn, because they have their own special education counsel. So if you're taking an attorney, they'll have their attorney there. So that's one person you do not want to take. And it's as a courtesy, I always tell clients to make sure if you are taking an extra person, other than, your spouse, if it's other than mom and dad or grandma, if it's an advocate or some other professional, or, if you have, related service providers through the medical assistants in a BSC or a mobile therapist. If you're taking somebody, a professional like that, it's as common courtesy, you should notify the district or the Elwyn that you're taking that person to the meeting, or if you're in the district, to the district. So the IEP is applicable to kids 3 to 21. So again, we're talking Part B regulations. If you're in the 0 to 3, you have an individual family service plan, which is quite different. But the early intervention, the 3 to 5, and then the 5 to 21, all those students have IEPs. So I listed here the main components of an IEP. I was not going to get into this part of it because I wanted to really talk about the transition process, and I suspect that somebody else is probably going to be giving a training on the specific components of the IEP. And I also have this great checklist, again, I can share with you, that I tell people, take it into your IEP meeting and photocopy it, and kind of use it as a checklist as you go through, to make sure you are going through each of these different parts of the IEP, and you'll have an understanding of what you should be talking about. So I really wasn't going to get into the specific components because I know we're supposed to be talking more about the transition process. But these are the main components of an IEP, and these are the types of things that you should be reviewing at your IEP meeting. We talked a little bit about the NORAP. So once the IEP is developed, the Elwyn will provide the parents with what we call the Notice of Recommended Educational Placement. The parent can either accept the changes by checking the consent box and signing, or the parent can disagree. You can check the box and file for due process, or you can request mediation to stop any changes from taking effect. So if this is the initial provision of services, the services cannot begin until parent initially consents. So this NORAP, this process would kind of take place once the parent approves the initial provision of services. So if the parent does file for due process, we have what we call pendency. So the last agreed upon IEP remains in effect until that matter is resolved through whatever you're going through, mediation or due process or settlement or whatever. But if the IU does, if the parent does nothing, if you do nothing, even if you don't check the box that you agree, the Elwyn can implement those changes, or the school district can implement those changes other than the initial provision of services. So, and I want to point out as well that although the IDEA does not specify the time frame in which a parent must make a decision, in the state of Pennsylvania, it's been interpreted that 10 days is a reasonable time frame within which to make that determination. But technically speaking, there is no actual set time frame. You will not find that in the IDEA or the regulations. In the IDEA or Pennsylvania regulations for that matter. It's just this I think a hearing officer mentioned one time it would be, 10 days sounds reasonable, and everybody kind of went with that. And now, most schools will say, we need this NORAP back within 10 days. I'm like, not really, not unless you're opposing a change in placement or opposing some change in services. If you don't really have an issue with the program, you don't have to do anything with it if you don't want to. So now we're going to jump into the actual transition process. And a lot of it might be redundant. So I will focus on, like I said, the actual process to the school age program. So children who are within 1 year of transition to a school age program, they must have some goals and objectives to address that transition process. So if you have a kiddo who's 4 and going to be going into kindergarten the following year, you should anticipate in your meeting talking about what's going to happen as far as what goals and objectives that they're going to put into place to make sure the transition is smooth, because that's really the goal of the transition, is to make sure the child has a smooth continuity of services. Obviously they're going to be changing like placements and providers, but you want that child to still have the supports and services that child needs in the next setting. So you want to have that continuity of services. And you want the new providers to have an understanding of the child before that child arrives as much as possible. So you want to have goals and objectives to address that transition process. And then in the child's last year of early intervention, there is the transition process that will occur to move the child from the preschool to a kindergarten program or first grade if the parent decides that they're not sending the child to kindergarten. Kindergarten is not required in Pennsylvania, just so everybody knows that. And the transition, all these transition supports and the process that I'm going to talk about is applicable to whether the parent chooses to move the child to the local school district or a charter school, because charter schools also fall under the IDEA. So when does everything really kick in? So if you have your IEP meeting, you might see some goals and objectives in the IEP around age 4, but really it'll start in the winter before the kindergarten in that fall. So by February 1st of each year, the preschool early intervention program must identify any children in their program who they anticipate transitioning to kindergarten that fall. Or first grade, and then they send the parents a letter explaining the transition process. And then the letter includes information for the parents about a meeting to discuss the transition to the school age program, and it gives the parents their options to register their child in a kindergarten program, or parents can choose to have their child remain in the IU program, and some parents decide to do that. Instead of, if they're on the younger side or if they're concerned about the program at the local school district, parents can elect to do that for 1 year. But the letter must also tell the parents that if their child ceases to be eligible when they actually reach the age of first grade. So you can't just basically keep the child in Elwyn indefinitely, but you can choose to keep your child in 1 extra year. So that's the process that starts the transition process, really, is that letter that's triggered by the early intervention program that goes to the parents. And then the meeting is held, and it's scheduled between February 1st and the end of February. So either February 28th or February 29th. So lots cooking in February. And at the meeting, you have the representatives from your local school at that meeting, as well as the representatives from the early intervention program. So could be overwhelming, but they're supposed to be providing you with information so you can make an informed decision as to whether you want to register your child for kindergarten, or if you're going to elect to keep your child in the IU for that additional year. If the parents do say they intend to register, then the local school district, that triggers the process with the local school district. And usually at this meeting, you might seem like you're signing your life away, but you're really not. They ask you to sign releases, and that it allows the records to certainly flow from the IU program or the Elwyn program to the school district. You certainly want the school district to have access to the records from the early intervention program.
What do you advise, Jennifer, what do you advise parents when they're bombarded with all this information to sign? What would be your recommendation?
If they intend to register, if they know that they want to intend to register, I would have them register. I'd have that intent signed there. And then I would definitely sign a release. And if the child I would also want the school to have any information from private service providers. So if the parents have, oftentimes kids are getting services through CHOP, and there's releases that need to be signed. So I would provide that information, or same with any, like I said, supports through your medical assistance program. If you have BSC, TSS, so you would want to make sure that the school district has that information, so you can sign a release to allow the school district to talk to those individuals. You want the school district to have as much information about your child to be able to develop an appropriate program placement. So any releases to talk to private service providers, releases to allow the records to go from the IU to the school, and the intent to register.
Would you recommend that parents maybe get photocopies of whatever it is that they sign?
Yes, but I'm a lawyer and I always recommend this.
I recommend the same thing.
Now, sometimes the schools will offer a prior written notice at that meeting, and you can sign the prior written notice as long as you're confident that you've reviewed it, and this is, it includes all the assessments that I want done. So the prior written notice, you may want to take that one with you and kind of take a look at it and make sure it has all the testing that you would want your child to undergo through the school district. So that one's up to you. But either way, a lot of times things are done through DocuSign now. And when you do sign through DocuSign, you just get a copy of it. But if everything's there and it's paper, ask whatever you sign, ask for a copy of, and you're entitled to a copy of it under FERPA. So yeah, you want to know who, at some point, like I've already asked my clients, do you ever sign a release to allow the school to talk to Dr. So-and-so? I don't know. I'm not sure. I think so, So it's always a good idea to have a copy of everything that you've signed to, going forward. And, this is a very paper driven area of law, and, and for parents, a lot of times like I said, the IEPs are large, the evaluation reports, and it's kind of a good idea to get that binder out and start making tabs for, your kindergarten. You're going to have progress reports, you're going to have evaluation reports, you're going to have the IEPs, you're going to have IEP revisions, you're going to have NORAPs, and you want to keep copies of everything. And if everything's being done digitally, create digital folders and keep it organized that way. And if at some point you're kind of lapsed and you're like, oh, I didn't keep all my records, shoot an email off, request all the records for your child, because the school is required to maintain those records, and just ask for everything, and they have 45 days to get it to you. So the meetings are at the transition meeting, the school is supposed to discuss these options with you. And this is if you choose to register your child. If you're saying, I want to keep my child, I'm not registering, this will happen the following year. You don't have to discuss these options. So you do have a couple of options at this meeting. You can adopt the early intervention preschool IEP for school age. I wouldn't recommend that, because you're really going from to me, it's quite a different program, going from early intervention to school age. But that could be proposed. You could adopt the early intervention preschool IEP with revisions, which I've seen done, and I don't necessarily oppose it. Or they could propose to do a reevaluation, the school district that you're going into. I always like to see a reevaluation of the child. It doesn't necessarily have to be before the child goes into school. And I look at it on a case-by-case basis. If we've had a recent evaluation from Elwyn or from the IU within the last couple of months, I think maybe it makes sense to adopt the preschool IEP with some revisions, so it makes sense for that child in the school age program, and then have the reevaluation done a month or so, like start that process once the child's actually in the building, in where the child's going to be attending school. Because if you choose,
Jennifer,
yeah.
My apologies. I apologize. One parent said her child is transitioning from Elwyn to the school district of Philadelphia.
Mm-hmm.
She wanted to know if a child has a developmental delay, would a meeting still occur with the school district?
Yes, the meeting would still occur. But what will happen is if the evaluation isn't done at that time, when a reevaluation is done, that won't be that disability category won't be an option in the school age program. So, again, I look at these things on everybody has their own way of doing things. I like to see some recent assessments. So if we have some good progress monitoring, and we can if you can review the current data and you get a good idea of where this kiddo is, you don't necessarily have to have an evaluation, but you might want to start that process after the child's been in the building with his or her peers, and you so the observations will be done in the school age program. The teacher input will be done in the school age program. The testing will occur when the child's exposed to, education every day on a continuous basis. So there's something to be said, and functional behaviors. If your child's having behaviors, I'd like to know what the behaviors look like in the school age program. So I feel if I have enough information about this child from the data that's being prepared by the preschool program, and we do have some recent testing, you don't necessarily have to opt for that reevaluation. But these are so you could adopt that under certain circumstances. You can adopt that early intervention preschool IEP with revision, so it matches a school age program, because like I said, the early intervention preschool program, they follow a different calendar, and their IEPs look a little bit different. You're getting this service for this unit, they talk in units, and it's not the same when you're in a school age program. 30 minutes for once per 6-day cycle. It's a little bit different. So you would want your IEP to reflect the actual calendar and the way that the school is doing that. So these are the options that are proposed at the meeting. But then after that meeting, within a reasonable time, but no later, this is a trigger date, but no later than April 15th, the district must notify the parent in writing indicating whether it is proposing to do a full reevaluation, which then would trigger that prior written notice. Whether it's proposing to do a reevaluation consisting solely of a review of existing data. Again, it doesn't necessarily require a prior written notice if they're just reviewing existing data. They can use their own forms. Some schools will use the invitation to a meeting, an invitation to a meeting, and check the reason would be other, and it would be review existing data. Some schools will use the prior written notice, or they can propose to waive a required reevaluation. If there's a reevaluation that's due, the triennial reevaluation. This is permissible by federal regulation, but only with the consent of the parent. So you would not see a parent proposing a waiver. You would see the preschool program saying, we have enough, we don't need any assessments, we don't need any input, we don't need to review any data. And it can only be, that can only happen if the parent approves that. Generally, I would not suggest that. I would propose to either go through with a full reevaluation if you don't have any good data, or I would have, I would propose to have the reevaluation reviewing that data. You could also have the reevaluation to review existing data. And when you get to, if the team reviews that data and realizes, hey, we don't have enough information here to really program for this child when he gets to school, then you can initiate the full reevaluation process. So the school makes this determination by April 15th, and the parents get this in writing, and can, again, your procedural safeguards kick in. You can either agree, disagree, depends on the data, like I said, that's available. And if you get it in writing and says they're requesting a waiver, you do not have to agree to it. You can say, no, I'd like to at least have a reevaluation consisting solely of the data and see what data is out there. Or you can say, I want to have a full reevaluation. So again, if the timelines are going, this is going to be a repeat because the timelines are the same. If the district is proposing a full reevaluation, it will issue that prior written notice. If the local district is only reviewing existing data, like I said, it can use its own form. This is where the 60 days kicks in. If the district has the 60 days to complete the RR, or the reevaluation from the date it receives that signed parental consent. And that's one thing you should always keep a copy of, is that signed parental consent on the prior written notice. I actually tell all my clients, either go in and hand it in to the office and have them timestamp or date stamp it and ask them to photocopy it and hand it back to you. Or if you're sending it in as a PDF, you email it and make sure you have some documentation of the date that it was, you can actually track when it was returned via email, because then that triggers the 60 days. And then the 30 days kicks in after the evaluation determines that the school or that the child's eligible. Now, if you decide, these timelines wouldn't kick in if you decide, well, we're just going to revise the IEP. So if we're going to either adopt the early intervention IEP or adopt it with revisions, you would actually have an IEP meeting, you would make those revisions, and then that would trigger a NOREP. It wouldn't trigger these timelines. So these timelines only kick in again if the district's doing an evaluation. So if the parents, again, if say the evaluation has taken place and the district proposes an IEP, if the parents don't agree with the IEP that's being offered for that school age program, the parents can file, they'll get that NOREP, they can file for due process, they can reject it and file. Remember the and file part, or both parties can agree to go to mediation. But what's important here is if the child must continue to receive the services in the last IEP. So if the parent is in a dispute with the school going into the school year, the early intervention IEP remains in effect until that dispute is resolved. And you might wonder, well, how can they do that? Well, the district is required to implement it as best they can. So, or provide as close as possible what those services would look like, but in a school age program. So that's something to keep in mind. It's not, if you're in a dispute, it's not like you're going to go into the school and your child's not going to have an IEP, period. But you do have to use your procedural safeguards. You do have to either ask for the mediation and the school has to agree, or you have to actually file for due process. So regardless of which option is chosen, if the child is eligible for, and when I talk about option, I'm talking about the option for an evaluation, that child will remain eligible for special education, and an IEP will be implemented no later than 10 school days at the beginning of the school term. So, and this again is so that school services and transition services and supports and services aren't interrupted in any way. Again, the whole goal is to make sure there's a smooth process. So the whole goal is to make sure that by the 10th day of school, all services kick in. And I know it might seem like a lot, but at the beginning of the school year, I was, tell parents not to be too up in arms if you're not getting speech and language day 2, because a lot of things happen at the very, very beginning of the school. Kids are getting, especially with kids going into school age programs with kindergarten. There's a lot of orientation going on, getting to, getting to know, the teacher and getting to know the students. And sometimes they don't even go full days. They're learning how to use the bus. And it could actually be very overwhelming for a child who's trying to just figure out where they're going, where their classroom is, and where they hang up their coat, where they're going for lunch, to then be pulled from something that very, those first few days of school. So, so that they build in that 10-day time frame so that they make sure that there's services begin within that 10 days. And eligibility, I know that there's some, parents concerned about what if there's an evaluation I've had parents say, well, what if the school district evaluates my child and determines that my child's not eligible? And that surely could happen. But all children who are currently eligible for preschool programs and registered with the school district, they remain eligible as long as or until an evaluation determines that they're no longer eligible. So if the early intervention program, if they're doing an evaluation, say the triennial evaluations do, and the early intervention program determines they're no longer eligible, or the school district does propose to do an evaluation and they determine the student's no longer eligible, they still have to issue that NOREP, that Notice of Recommended Educational Placement, exiting the child from special education services. And this would become critical and where you would want to make sure you file within 10 days. But if you think my child needs services, and I don't agree with this, then you would check the disagree box and you would file for due process. And while this case is pending before a hearing officer, or if you're at a mediation, you'll have pendency in your early intervention IEP. So you just have to do your due diligence as a parent to make sure you're actually filing or seeking an attorney to file with you. And this is where I would say that 10-day window is important, because they're proposing to remove all services. So you would want to make sure, even though this 10-day rule is not really in existence, hearing officers do follow it in the state of Pennsylvania. So you would want to make sure you're actually filing. And then it takes, when you file for due process, you have to have, the IDEA requires, I think within 10 days that you have a resolution meeting. And then within 45 days after that, you have your hearing. That never happens in the state of Pennsylvania. I filed for due process on a case at last April. And with all the continuances and I still don't have a hearing officer's decision. My hearing officer decision is not due until March 18th. There's another case I filed in July and we got the hearing officer decision in December. So during that time frame, your child's receiving services. So it really is it could be a long period of time. And during that period of time, your child will continue to receive those services. And that'll also give you time to figure out if you want to get an independent or whatnot. So we call that pendency. So if the district is changing, if the district is proposing, or the early intervention program is proposing something that you don't agree with, or removing services or changing a placement, that's when you'll want to reject and file, and then you'll have pendency in the last agreed upon program. They can't just remove that supports and services until you actually either agree or a hearing officer determines otherwise. One question we get is, do you have to transition your child? And the answer for that in that last year when you have that transition meeting, the answer is no. You do not. You can elect to keep your child unless your child's already elected to have that additional year. So if your child's turning 5 and is school age eligible, if you choose to keep your child in the IU program, you can do that. But interestingly, it's funded by the school district. I found that out early on, and it made it, I use it as a negotiation tactic because this child wanted to be in a different kind of a program. So I was able to negotiate a different program, and it ended up being billed back to the school district because the school district pays for the program, even though the IU is actually providing it. I don't know where that regulation came from, but it's an odd one. So in any event, parents can decline the transition, and I haven't seen any. I mean, there's maybe some pushback because they think that maybe the child's really ready and they're doing a disservice. But typically, if a parent, from what I've seen, if a parent says I'm not signing the intent to register, there's really no repercussions. So then you just move on to what's the program going to look like that following year. And the following year, this whole transition process will kick in, and you don't have a choice. Then you're booted. You got to do something because by first grade, your child has to be attending a first grade program. They don't have to, like I said, they don't have to attend kindergarten in the state of Pennsylvania. So I love this little comic. Well, let's stop arguing. We're both here now. So there may be a point in time where you're in a dispute. We talked about the different things that you could be in a dispute about. Parents have lots of different options. You will get, as a parent, you will get a packet called procedural safeguards. Most parents say they recycle them, but if you are in a dispute, you will want to read them or call an attorney or an advocate who knows what your options are. But there are a lot of different options in order to resolve disputes. And what I can tell you is nobody likes to get into a dispute. The early intervention preschool program does not want to be in a dispute with you. They don't want to go to a due process hearing just as much as you don't want to. So the Office of Dispute Resolution is the agency that governs or oversees all the disputes. So they have a lot of different options. You can ask for the Office of Dispute Resolution to provide an IEP facilitator. And you have it's basically a mediator who'll come to your IEP meeting and try to get the parties to agree on an IEP. I've been to IEP meetings with a facilitator. They can be beneficial. So you can try that route if you're, in a dispute and you want to try and resolve the issues. You can go to mediation. Actually, I screwed up my slide here. Mediation in the past, parents couldn't take counsel to mediation, but I think it started last year in March. Parents are now allowed to attend mediation with counsel and now allowed to go with parents. So that is an option. A resolution meeting occurs after the filing of a due process complaint. And that again can be facilitated by ODR, by the Office of Dispute Resolution. I've had facilitated resolution meetings where they will send an independent person to come and try and get the parties to agree to resolve the differences. This would be after you file the complaint. But again, another step in trying to resolve your case. Filing for due process, that triggers the resolution meeting. You actually can have a resolution meeting before you file the complaint. I've done that already too. I've contacted ODR and said, we have an issue. The district knows what my issues are. Can we schedule a resolution meeting before filing the complaint? And they're like, of course you can. So you can have a resolution meeting before you file a complaint, or you can actually file for the due process complaint. And then within 10 days, you're required to have that resolution meeting. And also ODR offers what we call a hearing officer settlement conference, where you file the complaint. And if you would like to go to a settlement conference, they will pull another hearing officer not assigned to your case to listen to the issues and try to get the parties to agree. And I did include the website for ODR. If you go to that website, it has all kinds of information about all the remedies available. It also has, if you're interested in reading hearing officers' opinions, it has recent hearing officers' opinions listed there, but lots of information. So I included that website for you. If you decide, hey, do I want to go to mediation? The forms are there. You can fill that out yourself. If you want to go to due process without counsel, when I file a due process complaint, I have my own, I file a complaint, but there's a form that parents can use. Parents do not need counsel to go to due process. Due process is, how do I explain it? It's more like a trial without a jury. So in the criminal world, we'd call that a bench trial. It's a more formal process than mediation or your IEP facilitation, and that's where you have a stenographer there. You're presenting evidence. You have exhibits. So it's a much more formal process, and it can be daunting. It's daunting for attorneys, but it can be daunting for parents as well. So I would suspect most parents would not want to go to a due process hearing without counsel, but you can, and you can complete the form, especially if you're in that 10-day time crunch and you just want to stop the clock, you want pendency, you can file that complaint all on your own. That'll kick in pendency, and it also, gives you time if you want to have an attorney review your complaint. So I don't know if I have anything else. Oh, I did create another one. There are a variety of remedies available under the IDEA, and quite frankly, the IDEA is an administrative. It's not a punitive statute, so it's a remediation. It provides for remediation rather than punitive damages. You can't pursue damages. You can't pursue. We get a lot of parents who have been, emotionally distressed over different things, but you can't pursue any damages for emotional distress, or you can't pursue typical tort cases, but you can pursue other remedies. So we call it a remedial statute. So compensatory education, or comp ed. So if your child has lost certain supports and services and you want the school to make up those services, so we call that compensatory education. And that's one of the top things that we pursue. We look at a case and we're like, you should have been providing speech and language, or you should have been providing a behavior plan. And because of that, the child lost out on this amount of progress. So you need to make that up in the form of hours. And as attorneys, we convert those hours into funds of money for parents to be able to access. But you could, through due process, and mediation, you could be pursuing an appropriate program and placement for your child. You can seek reimbursement for tuition and other costs that you may have spent on private school if you ended up pulling your child from the public program and putting them in private school. Any out-of-pocket expenses that you may have had for your child, you can ask for reimbursement. But so these aren't considered damages. You're asking for reimbursement of money that you spent out or that you put out. Or attorney's fees. And that's one nice thing under the IDEA, under the Part B regulations only, is that if a parent does pursue the early intervention program or the school district and they prevail at a hearing, then the school has to pay the parents reasonable attorney's fees. So there's always incentive for both parties to resolve, especially for the school side, because once you go to a hearing, fees can become quite exorbitant. So there's a lot of incentive if there's some exposure, if their attorney feels like there's a possibility that you might be ordered to pay compensatory education, and if that's the case, or you're going to be ordered to pay for an appropriate program placement, you're going to have to pay the parents' counsel fees. So that it makes it better for the parents, and easier for parents to pursue cases. Many attorneys will just, if they see a case, they'll take the risk. They won't even charge parents. They'll just take the risk of getting paid, because if they see a decent case, the attorney's going to know, I'm either going to go to due process and I'm going to win, or they're going to settle. So I'll take that risk, and so it takes the burden off parents who are already dealing with a lot. If a parent ends up, in an attorney's office, it's usually after, a long battle with the school. Usually we're seeing parents like at the end of their rope, not at the beginning of the process. Usually parents will start out with advocates to help them navigate the process. And then, and we work a lot with advocates, because at some point, if there's a dispute that can't be resolved, then they end up going to counsel. So the fact that the attorney's fees are taken off the table is it takes that burden off the parents who are already dealing with a lot of emotional issues with what's happening on their plate. So, and then I included my information on this last. Do they have I don't know. Is this shared with everybody on the? Because if not, it is. Okay.
Believe it or not, yes, we do. Parents will just email out and they'll let us know if they're interested in receiving a copy of the report. But I do have a few questions for you, if you don't mind.
Sure.
That came up. So one thing I wanted to say is a fun fact. If your child is in the birth to 3, your child would qualify if they have a 25% delay or more in one area, but they can also qualify based upon a specialist determination, even if there is no delay. That's called informed clinical opinion, but that is not applicable to school age. There must be a delay. So a couple questions for you. One is, my child has a settlement agreement from the IU, and he's due to transition to the school district this year. The last agreed upon IEP is really old and hasn't been worked on. We instead adopted the Word doc IEP, created goals and objectives that have been with appropriate baseline. And of course, we have supporting data. I am really fearful that the school is legally required to implement that last agreed upon, she put in parentheses, very old IEP. Do I have any recourse?
Well, under that circumstance, it's going to be difficult because you have two different entities involved. So the settlement agreement is with the IU and it's not with the school district. So under the circumstances, if you're transitioning, my advice is if you're transitioning to the school age program and you don't have a recent IEP within the last year, you will want the school district to do an evaluation and offer an IEP. And then hopefully that IEP is acceptable. If that's not acceptable, you're in a kind of a quandary, because if you file for due process and you don't agree to the school's proposed IEP, there has to be some sort of last agreed upon IEP, and you may end up having to kick back to the very old one or accepting the school's new one if it's a little bit better. But if it's still not appropriate, you can still file for due process.
So the parent followed up and she said, and I apologize, they have been working on their own internal goals and objectives, and they have all the data support that the child has made a lot of progress with this. Is this something that they can provide to the district for the district, and should they strongly consider?
Yes, absolutely. Again, you would want to share all the information that you have with your, with the school, because you want the school to have as much information as possible so they can develop an appropriate program and placement. And another thing I want to point out, just so everybody knows, is when you get a NORAP and there's boxes on there that you can check that you agree, you disagree, or you want to have a meeting, or you can, if you disagree, you can check for due process or mediation, or you can check to have an informal meeting. You can actually, and you might want to consider, the person asking this question might want to consider doing this, is you could actually check the box, you agree, but put an asterisk behind there, and it either write right on there or below it or attach, I agree with these services, but I don't agree with these services. So you're still agreeing to that IEP, and you can dispute that current IEP, especially if it's better than the very, very old one that you have. So you can agree to certain services and disagree, and the services that you're having a dispute about, just go to due process over that. But that way your child's still receiving some of the services that you agree to. So you don't realize that you can kind of have it both ways. But that is, I will tell my clients all the time, never just agree, because that IEP can't be perfect. So if you want these certain services, agree, but you can put on there, it does insufficient speech and language services, or requires more behavioral support, or requires a one-to-one, agree with the IEP except doesn't include one-to-one. You can put all that stuff in there.
Okay, just a reminder, we're going to be stopping the recording if that hasn't happened already. And then we're going to put up another poll while